someone was throwing a ball, and Cardinal Pell and I were competing to catch it. And I was pretty fit and strong. He was still a big guy, and so I kept jumping ahead and whacking him, and he'd start punching me. It was such fun. And after a while, he was getting frustrated. He'd clonk me on the back of the head.
Good everyone, welcome to the Thomas More Centre channel. My name is Mark Makowiecki, and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Steve Lawrence. Steve is a former AFL umpire, father of 6, and a leadership coach. Steve, welcome to the channel.
Thank you, Mark. I'm sorry to do this, but I'm going to have to actually correct you straight away.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't an umpire, I was a player.
Did I say umpire?
You did say umpire.
I said umpire.
You did say umpire.
I'm going to restart that because that would save me editing. That's embarrassing.
No, keep it in. It's just, I just had to mention that because
no, I don't.
I'm far too tall for an umpire, for one. And
an umpire. Our last guest, I had his name right the whole time, and then I called him Adrian for some reason. So mental decline at my age, I don't know.
That's good. That's good.
Anyway, I reserve the right to edit that, but we'll see how we go. So, Stephen, you founded the Ultim Leadership Group, which offers leadership training to those working in Catholic settings. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. So it was about 8 years ago that I started my own business, Ultim Leadership Group, and mainly because apart from having played football, most of my adult life has been working in faith contexts, in mission or in education, and working with leaders and helping them grow in their capacity to serve their communities or their organizations. So that's really what I do, primarily through coaching, mentoring and speaking, as well as special projects. So I'm working with leaders of faith in education, like say principals or priests, diocesan organizations, and really consulting, helping them navigate some of the tricky landscapes so that they can really help to nurture and fan the flame of faith in their people, and also build their capacities, their capabilities, inspiring and equipping them to help them in the very tricky ways, but to help them become better in their leadership roles and guide their people effectively, I guess, more and more effectively. So and there's a lot of opposition to faith, and there's a lot of opposition even in Catholic organizations. So sometimes overt, but largely just other. So how do we help create attraction? How do we help draw people out? How do we help people build their communities and so forth? So that's basically what I do, and I'm working all around in different dioceses in Australia and schools. And
so you were actually born in South Africa, but moved to Australia when you were 5 years old. Can I ask what brought your family out to Australia, and have you been back since?
Well, my mum and dad came out in 1975, so it was really during the apartheid period. They were keen to get away from the problems that were present there. It was a very difficult scenario. They were obviously white South Africans. There was also the potential civil war emerging. This was so nearly 20 years before Mandela came out of prison. So it was in the midst of the heights of apartheid. My dad had played Test cricket, so he was very aware of, it was a big factor in our upbringing. I was one of 4 boys, so they really wanted to go away from apartheid and be in a different place. So they considered Canada and then Australia, and I think the weather and the culture of Australia won out. So I've been back since that time. Been in Australia for 50 years basically, and I'm 56 years old. But I have not yet been back, which I would love to do, but the opportunity hasn't arisen at this point.
Yeah. You mentioned that your father was a Test cricketer. Was he playing at the time when South Africa were kind of banned from the international scene?
No, he wasn't. He played, so he was actually Rhodesian born, so Zimbabwe, and played for first-class cricket for a number of years, but only played for South Africa at the end of his career. And he only played the one season before having a back operation. He had a fantastic season. He got 28 wickets, so he held the record for the most wickets by a South African fast bowler for a few decades until Alan Donald. So he did very, very well. Got 8 for 53 in one innings and so forth. But he was. I think the apartheid bans were later. So he wasn't in that period exactly, but he did play with people like Mike Proctor and Barry Richards and those sorts of guys who then later were not able to play international Test cricket, but played in the World Series cricket and things like that of the 70s.
Yeah. So you came out and your family wasn't initially very religious, right?
It's true. That's true. Yeah. Mum and Dad. Well, Dad had faith from when Dad was an orphan, was sent to a Jesuit boarding school, and one of the priests there. So Dad's background was not Catholic at all. His mum was Anglican, but sort of nominal. But it was the influence of one of the priests at the Jesuit boarding school, St. George's College, which really influenced and inspired my dad. It was the priest who actually taught him how to play cricket, and who also taught him faith and character. So Dad was baptised as a 15-year-old. Made the choice himself, and he received really the gift of faith through that influence of that priest, but also the story in a catechism class of Our Lady of Lourdes, and the story of Lourdes. Really, I think he received an infusion of the faith, the Catholic faith, as a teenager, and he was stunned to think of the story of Our Lady appearing to, Saint Bernadette. And my dad died only a few months ago, but on the back of his little card, we put an image of Our Lady of Lourdes because of the influence of Our Lady. He also loved Our Lady of Fatima and others, but so his faith was strong all his life since that time. But Mum wasn't really so much strong in her faith. So we grew up with Mass on a Sunday, and with grace before meals, but really, in many ways, we were just like a secular family, in largely speaking. But it was much later, when I was about 11 or 12, when 1980 Dad went to Fatima at that time, and it was only after coming back from Fatima that he really began to really encourage us to grow in personal faith and in prayer of the Rosary, and the influence of John Paul II, who was Pope at the time. And that was where my faith really grew, was after that period when Dad was teaching us to pray the Rosary and things like that. So, and the reason we went there, it's a question you were going to ask me, I'll just jump into it. The reason he went there was because at that time, Mum and Dad were beginning to go through a very difficult period in their relationship, in their marriage. There were historic difficulties which only became evident to us boys at this period, but Dad knew that he needed some sort of strengthening, and that was why he went on pilgrimage.
Okay.
But things did fall apart over those next few years, and that's part of my story.
Okay. How important was your dad's spiritual leadership in terms of forming your own attitude to faith? So
it was hugely important. Yeah, hugely important. So Dad had been in some way, like Dad was a salesman, and when we came to Australia, we didn't have any extended family apart from my dad's brother's family. My mum's family weren't there. So Mum went through a kind of, I guess, a nervous breakdown. It was very difficult for my mum. Her brother had been in a horrific motorcycle accident. So Mum was really struggling in many ways. And I would say from the time of my teenage years especially, Dad, who had a few, because of the stress and other factors, Dad had a few heart attacks and ended up being like a home dad. Mum was teaching and we went to school. So Dad became very present during my teen years, which was probably a restoration of our relationship. Not that it was bad, it was very good, but he was often working a lot and driving up and down. We were living at Wollongong at that time. Then we moved to Brisbane, where I grew up as a teen. But during that period, Dad would kind of take us together before school and start to teach us how to pray. And of course, at the beginning, we were very resistant, my brothers and I certainly was. But I found that over a period of time, it was growing on me, and something was cultivated inside of my spirit. And so he had put together this kind of big folder with lots of pictures of decades of, like the pictures of mysteries of the Rosary and scripture texts and, inspiration of lives, St. Francis or Maximilian Kolbe or something from John Paul II or whatever. And so I found, whilst praying the Rosary, just looking at these images of, let's say the first joyful mystery, the Annunciation, or just things like that. And it became the beginnings of a life of prayer that's cultivated since that time. And I desired to grow in that, and I found that God was really beginning to enter into my life, and I was becoming, faith was important. And Dad's influence was also, to encourage us to go not only Sunday Mass, but daily Mass where possible. So often I would go to morning Mass at 6:30 in the morning before school. And so prayer and faith, and of course, with all the mum and dad's conflict that was going on during those years, which was actually quite a brutal psychological and verbal conflict, that mum became very kind of aggressive towards my dad, really. And in all of that, I discovered I had deep questions about life and suffering and evil and all of that. And so I was really searching for meaning and understanding. And so I was reading catechisms and I was sort of reading deeply. And like there wasn't much around at that period. This was the 1980s. It was a bit of a spiritually bereft period culturally in the church, even in Australia. So I was reading encyclicals of John Paul II, as a 15-year-old and 16-year-old, which I think is quite unusual, but it was very, very nourishing. And of course, his influence, John Paul II's influence, was also very, very important. And my dad and John Paul II were like my spiritual fathers of that period. But Dad his love and affection and presence and encouragement have always been very, very important to me. So I would say it was pivotal, my dad's role in my spiritual life. Yeah.
Yeah, because I can imagine a lot of people, if with this intensification of kind of faith happening, and it coincides with, I guess, home difficulties and whatnot, a lot of people could develop a negative association, if you know what I mean. So for you, it was more of an anchor rather than something you couldn't disentangle from each other.
It's true. So it's hard to say this without sounding critical of my mum, but basically my mum really had lost it during that period, and for about 5 years became deeply antagonistic and aggressive, to the point I could tell stories really where mum became like, there was, the way I would put it is very, very, what's the word? Well, there was a real presence of evil going on in my home. Mum's not evil. I love my mum. We get on very well. But at that time, there was really a huge attack on what Dad was doing spiritually, and it became evident psychologically and emotionally and verbally. So Dad was actually in many ways attacked all the time, day after day after day, for hours on end. So what I saw was, and there was a lot of this was my mum adopted a kind of very aggressive anti-male sort of perspective, like deeply sort of hatred masculine. So it's kind of radical feminist sort of presence. I don't mean Christian feminism of John Paul II, but I mean hatred of my dad, really, and anything masculine or male or the church. Mum left the church at this time. So there was a real persecution which was against the faith as well as against masculinity. And so this was deeply wounding for me, of course, and for my brothers, because by inference we also kind of received this. So yes, it was I guess for me it was a question of where's God in the middle of this, and where do I stand? And I found myself embracing faith, and I also had my own personal experiences of faith, which were very powerful in the middle of this, and that Jesus was really present in my life and that he was really there. And I had a really powerful encounter with Jesus as a 15-year-old. And I realized it was something transformative and I wanted it. It wasn't just favoring Dad or something like that. It was really personally called into this. But in the context of all of that, I had to really make some decisions there was cost for it to make those decisions. And I was willing to make those decisions. And I could see that was, in hindsight, it was a very big gift from God. I mean, blessings come in often great
strange packages
forms, but So I wouldn't change anything from one point of view because it was such a gift to bring about faith and a life of real reliance on God's grace in my life and His hand on my life, even in the middle of great struggle. But of course, there's a lot of grief about the whole thing that was very deeply wounding. But yes, I would say that it was a pivotal period of shaping my whole trajectory of my life.
Hmm. So we've already touched on the fact that you come from a gifted sporting family. Can you tell us how important sport was, in addition to faith, in terms of getting you through the difficult years at home?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was firstly not a question of getting through the difficult years. It was just something that we loved doing. All of my brothers were very good at many sports, and so we spent many hours all the time, like cricket outside, or football, or soccer. Or my oldest brother Paul was a champion javelin thrower and first grade cricketer, and my brother Dave was a Queensland karate champion, and my brother Mike was also very good at all sorts of sports. So sport was huge. Most sports we just turned our hand to. We were good at. We had good hand-eye coordination, and very competitive. As brothers in the backyard, and a lot of fighting, and you could imagine. And Mum was also a very good sports person. Like she played high-level tennis. She played with people like Virginia Wade and things like that. So Dad played not only cricket but also hockey at an international level, and he still holds a record, I think, for the fastest swimming backstroke at his school in Year 7 or something. So all sorts of things. So we just love sport. It was just the air you breathe. Some families it's music, some families it's politics or whatever. Sport was big in our family, and so weekends were always playing cricket or playing something or other. Rugby, soccer, football. So yeah, huge passion for sport. My mum, a very gifted teacher and English teacher, and she pulled her hair out about how do I get Steve to be reading books, because I was always outside. And she succeeded by getting me to read Asterix and Tintin, and
Ah,
then
yeah, the best.
oh, of course, and then later Agatha Christie.
Calvin and Hobbes, or was that too early?
Sorry,
I was thinking Calvin and Hobbes is another one of my
I
favorites,
didn't
but
get
it might
into
have
Calvin and
came
Hobbes,
a
but
little later. Yeah.
yeah, and then it was later, novels was through Agatha Christie as a Year 9 student, and after that, reading was off I went. But sport was really the big thing, and I would say it did provide a great way. Like it was something I went to. It meant I didn't have to be mulling around at home. And even my very best friend, whose house I regularly went to as a kind of refuge, didn't know. Like I didn't talk about our family life. I didn't talk about it with anybody, even with my brothers. It was strangely something I kept to myself. We didn't really talk about it, and I don't know if it was shame or just didn't think about it. Certainly, but I did love to be outside and get out. Like I loved school. I had lots of friends at school in different groups and things like that. And I was a pretty good student. So it was sport, school, friendship. These were all things that I was part of beyond home. But home was a place where there was a great deal of suffering all the time.
So, talking about sporting prowess, in year 11, you were drafted to the Hawthorn Football Club, the most successful footy club in the 1980s. Can you tell us what your memories were from that time, and I suppose how you came to be drafted? Because I believe you're more of a hockey player.
Well, yeah. Well, cricket was my first passion, and I did have ambition for cricket. I was a very good cricketer. Got a lot of fast bowler, in swinging bowler, and big hitting batsman. And I had ambitions. I wanted to play for Australia in cricket. And my dad Dad did a lot of coaching at our school, at Clairvaux College, and basically brought the standard up significantly right across, not just the teams that he coached, but pretty much anybody. He was always very happy to coach anybody and help them learn how to do this or that. And he was, so cricket was a big thing. And my dad had a very good eye for good cricketers. And he said, look, all of us were very talented cricketers. So that was the idea. The natural progression was to play cricket for Australia, but played a lot of hockey as well, was my winter sport. And then a friend of mine from Melbourne introduced me to play AFL footy, which didn't really exist much at all in Brisbane at that time. This is the 1980s. And I very quickly became good at it and was playing both sports, and eventually hockey dropped off because I love footy more. And I was playing for Queensland and things like that. And then in year 11, I was asked by Hawthorn to this was it was before the draft, actually. They had zone system, but I was recruited by Hawthorn before the Brisbane Bears, which are now the Lions, was going to come into the league. So after that period, I would have been in the zone of Brisbane. But so Hawthorn put me on a binding contract prior to that, just to secure my contract, my signature. It was entirely surprising. I had no ambition or thought to ever play AFL footy. So I did not expect it at all. So this, in my life, this is where a door opened from the point of view of God's grace. Like cricket didn't open, but it did in footy. So I signed the contract. Mum and Dad were both supportive of the idea. It was a 3-year binding contract. I never had any obligation to come to Melbourne to play footy, but it just meant that if I was going to go to anybody, it would be Hawthorn. But naturally, at the end of my year 12 year, I came down and had a year contract playing for Hawthorn. And it's true, my teammates were the superstars of the era. They played in Premiership after Premiership after Premiership. Dermot Brereton, Gary Ayres, Michael Tuck, Johnny Platten, Jason Dunstall. I'm actually now a life member. I've been 12 years I played at Hawthorn. I'm jumping the gun here, but Gary Ayres, mentioning his name, I'm going on a tour of the new Dingley. A lot of past players are been doing these tours. Gary Ayres is working for the club at the moment. I don't know if you know Gary Ayres, but superstar player.
I'm an Adelaide fan, so he coached the Crows for some years.
Of course.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so we sorry about last week, by the way.
Oh, that was tough. 3 points.
Yeah, I think we sort of stole that at the end. But anyway, yeah, so I did come to Hawthorn. I felt somewhat fraudulent that I was this skinny Brisbane boy, not from really even a footy culture family or anything like that, to sort of be recruited by Hawthorn. And I was really outside of the level. I was nowhere near the capacity of, which of course is normal. I'm playing now with the reigning Premiership team from '86. So, but I remember my first pre-season vomiting and just not being able to sort of keep the standard, and couldn't do one chin up. I was so skinny and so weak. I was tall and I was 50 kilograms less than I am now. No shorter. So in that first pre-season, I thought, I'm just not going to cope with this. How am I going to do it? So I was shocked that 5 years later I played in the Premiership. But and even one season later, my capacities had grown such that I was able to, play my first senior game in round 5 of the second season. So yeah, it was an unusual pathway for a boy from Brisbane who was from South Africa to play AFL footy. There's no doubt about that.
Now, interestingly, you for some people at least, you kept attending mass during your AFL career, and this led to a couple of notable incidents in which you witnessed to the faith. The first one was on a bus heading to a training camp at Phillip Island. Can you tell us about it?
Before I mention the story, yeah, it's true. My faith was always important. And when I did come to Melbourne, I guess I had to make the decision, is my faith my dad's faith that I just am doing because he's of his influence, or is it something I really want for myself? And I quickly realized, actually, it's what I want for myself. So, yes, I did continue to practice my faith and, in fact, became more and more committed in it. So, yeah, daily mass, even weekly mass, was always something I made a priority of. And I tried to also live my life with integrity, and not saying I did it perfectly, but I certainly had values and standards that were sometimes challenged, when I was in the footy world. And I always wanted to be one of my teammates. I never wanted to be judging or superior to anybody or critical, but there were moments where I had to try and, deal with challenges that were conflicting. And so this is a background to the story. So, yeah, on this particular occasion, all the players got into a bus to go to a training camp at Phillip Island for a few days. And I got in the bus. I was sitting at the back of the bus, 2 players to my right, 2 players to my left. And immediately upon the bus starting to go out of the out of the Glenferrie Oval car park, the bus driver turns onto the television, an X-rated pornographic film. And there's it met with quite a bit of approval within the bus. And I thought, oh no, because I'd seen pornography before. I knew how poisonous it was. I knew that I didn't want to be looking at that. I knew how unhelpful it would be if I had these images running around my mind, nighttime or whatever. And at the same time, I've got all of, my teammates on the bus, and I'm sitting at the back of the bus, and this is going on. And, and I thought, what am I going to do? Something's got to be done, but I just thought I've got to avoid this. So I just sort of tried to just not look at it like that, and was looking out the window. But of course, the sounds were, the sounds were very much kind of loud and stimulating. And I thought, this is ridiculous, So I said a short prayer under my breath. And I said, Lord, something's got to be done. And then, not realizing what had happened, I just stood up and started walking down the bus. And I'd been at the club a few years. I was still a young guy, but wasn't like my first season. And all my teammates were some of the, big on TV and superstar players. And I was really nervous. What are people going to think? But at the same time, there'd been, you live with people day after day. They get to know what you believe and what's important to you and what you stand for and, those sorts of things. So it wasn't like entirely surprising. So as I was walking down the bus, what started to emerge was this, ooh, got Stevie's going to do something, because, there were other times where things not dissimilar where I had to not be part of it or whatever, which were not easy. It was very difficult because you don't want to be the odd one out, but at the same time. Anyway, so it just got louder and louder. Whoa, oh no. Now, I don't know how it looked. I'm walking down the bus. It seemed a long way. I wish I wasn't so far. And I might have, I don't know how it looked, but in fact, I was sweating. My knees were knocking. My heart was banging. My tongue was going dry, and I had no idea what I would do. But something needed to be done. So I'm walking down, and it was like, whoa, like that really ramped right up. And just as I arrived at the bus driver, a moment before I'd sort of gotten there, I noticed that to the left of him, immediately behind him, was a player who I knew was 17, Luke McCabe, who's from South Australia. And so I leant into the bus driver's ear and I said to him, you have a minor on board this bus. What you're doing is illegal. This just thought popped into my mind. Now, you're in these moments where there's a clash, a conflict, and you're kind of opposing somebody. You expect I expected him to turn around and say, hey, F off, mate, or something. But because that often is the response in such situations. But I was shocked by his response because he simply didn't say a word, didn't turn around, didn't say anything. He just turned it off. And that was it. But that was the easy bit because then I had to turn around and face my 45 teammates and walk back. My legs were shaking and I'm expecting the proverbial tomatoes to be hurled at me, Stevie, what are you doing? No one said a thing. It was silence. And I seemed far longer walking back. And I got back into my seat. My legs were literally shaking. I sat down. My two mates were sitting there. My other two teammates were sitting there. And then after a while, everything just resumed. The bus, not the film, but just the trip, and people started to talk. And here am I thinking, this is a massive thing. And nobody said a thing to me in the bus. Nobody mentioned it to me during the 3 days of the training camp. Nobody referred to it week after week. In fact, that whole season never got mentioned. Was it a case of, what happened on the footy trip stays on the footy trip? Or I had no idea, but I felt really awkward, very self-conscious. These guys think I'm some sort of prude or something. Never was mentioned. And over a few years, I began to think, did I imagine that? Was it like a dream or was it something that happened in my imagination? It took 18 years until it was ever referred to by anybody directly to me. And it was the funeral of our legendary coach, Alan Jeans. And I caught up with two of my teammates for coffee, Andy Collins, who's assistant coaching at Hawthorn, and Darren Pritchard, Premiership players, both of them, terrific guys. And Andy Collins, Collo, he said to me, Stevie, do you remember that time you turned the porno off on the bus? And I thought, yes, it really happened. For one, my memory wasn't failing me. But like I said, I do remember it. He goes, well, I need to tell you something about that. I said, what? He goes, well, as you know, I've been coaching in South Australia for the last few years. He was coaching West Adelaide in the SANFL. And he said, and often I'm asked to speak about leadership. And, he said, I want you to know that for the last few years, whenever I go around, I'm speaking at schools or businesses or sporting groups or community groups, whatever, on the topic of leadership, he said, I always tell that story. I said, are you kidding me? I've not heard it back, He said, yeah, he said, and when I tell that story, I say, it's the greatest act of leadership I've ever seen. I said, really? He goes, yeah, because he said, you knew that it was the right thing to do. You knew nobody agreed with you, but you still did it anyway. I said, well, on that occasion, that is true. And he goes, I was amazed by that. I said, really? Here am I thinking, he thinks I'm an idiot, or these guys think I'm an idiot or something. And Darren Pritchard said, yeah, me too. I was impressed. I thought, what? Here I'm thinking for 18 years, these guys think I'm an idiot. And at the same time, they're in fact respecting that.
Yeah.
And, it was really important for me to hear this story back. It was like, you know what? Just do what's right always. No matter who your audience is, don't calculate 10 people know this, 5 know that, or 1. Doesn't matter who knows what. Doesn't matter who knows. Just do what's right. And, also I learned from this that the truth and, doing the right thing, it has its own power. It has its own life. I would say that's like the Holy Spirit working, touching people. Sometimes things just, and even you don't always have it's not like you can prepare for those moments. They just happen, So you've just got to do it, Sometimes it's clumsy or whatever. Doesn't matter. And so anyway, that was an important moment for me also to grow and to sort of become more myself in that situation. Yeah.
Yeah. You also tell of another time in 1995 when you had misgivings about playing footy on Easter Sunday. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, one of my struggles had been, obviously as a committed Catholic, we want to put, Sunday, the day of the Lord. It's the first day of the resurrection. So Mass is a priority and, worship of God and not work is also important. And obviously people who work in certain professions have to work and so be it, especially medical, or if you might have a job that you can't get out of it. I understand all that. But nevertheless, how do I'm now working and I'm playing footy, and also other people who sell pies or, who work at the gate, they also have to work because it's a foot. And so it was a thing in my mind, should I, is that the right thing? And I did wrestle a little bit with it. But there was this particular season, it might have been 94, I can't remember, might have been 95, one of those seasons.
I looked it up. I checked when you were playing, was it Richmond?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, 95,
so,
round 3, I think.
Thank you. That's helpful because I sometimes say 94 when I tell that story. And anyway, when the fixture was out that year, it was Easter Sunday. I thought, Easter Sunday? This, like, at some point, where do I have to draw a line here? So I really took it to prayer and I said, Lord, do you want me to not play on Easter because it's, Easter? Or should, as a witness, or should it be? And I prayed about it and got some advice. And in the end, I decided, the word that came to me was the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so, I have a duty to my teammates, to my club and everything. But still, I never failed to miss Sunday. I never failed to go to Mass on a Sunday, even playing in Perth or Sydney or wherever. In most places you can easily find a Mass if you really try, especially capital cities and not like in the regions. But so I never missed a Sunday Mass, and that was always a bit difficult at times. But so I decided, okay, I'm going to play. But I said, Lord, I really want to somehow honour you on this day of the resurrection and please open the door for me to have an opportunity to give witness to the resurrection. So that was my prayer. Anyway, in the week of Easter, so Holy Week, at the beginning of the week, we had a training session, and after training, we had a meeting. Coach was Peter Knights, legendary Hawthorn player, great guy. I really liked Peter Knights. But didn't really have any religious faith, and knowledge of the situation. So he unwittingly, he said at the meeting, this Friday, because when we had a Sunday game, we would have our last session for training at that time was on 2 days before. So in this case, it was a Friday. This Friday, instead of training at 5 o'clock, which we typically were at that time, because we're still semi-professional and guys would work during the day and then come to training after work. So this was before fully professional. And he said, we're going to train at 3 o'clock because it's a holiday on Friday. So let's train at 3 o'clock, not 5 o'clock. And I'm thinking, Good Friday, 3 o'clock. Now there's a shifted new problem. And so I went up to him after training. I said, Knightsy, as you know, I'm a committed Catholic. And Friday, this Friday is Good Friday, and 3:00 on Good Friday is the very moment that Jesus died on the cross. Okay, and so the ceremony of the Passion, what we call the ceremony of the Passion, happens at that hour. It's not a flexible time like a Sunday Mass. I often go to Mass Saturday night, early morning or afternoon, but this is not flexible. I don't want to get out of training, but like this is something I can't, He goes, well, there are times you've got to make compromises. I thought, oh my gosh. I said, well, maybe it is, but this is not one. I said, I really want to train, but I can't train at 3:00. He goes, all right, how about this? How about you come down at 1:00? You and I have a training session, and then you can be gone by 2:30. I said, great, let's do that. So this is what happened. So I came down on Good Friday, 1:00 in the afternoon to Glenferrie Oval, and it was just me and the coach. And I tell you what, he made me pay. He was still a very fit guy, and we had a great training session, just one-on-one, and we were wrestling and punching and, one-to-one training. It was my most fun training session of my entire footy career. And it was really hard. And anyway, on the Sunday, we played Richmond, and as it turns out, on that occasion, I was the best player on the ground. And after the match, I was, asked to be in an interview, as you sometimes see on the TV or the radio, and it was 3AW. And somehow, and I was put the earphones on and asked. It wasn't TV, it was radio, and they said, "Oh look, we're not quite ready yet for this interview, Steve. Just tell us something, anything. Tell us something. What's news with you?" While we wait, and I thought, here I am. I've been praying for weeks for an opportunity to give witness to the resurrection. It's Easter Sunday. I'm on public radio. And I'm being asked not to talk about the footy, but to talk about anything that's news. And I said, I think it was Tim Lane. I said, Tim, I've got great news. Today is Easter Sunday, and Jesus rose from the dead. That's my news. And then and he goes, whoa. And it opened up this conversation, which lasted for just like 2 minutes while we were waiting, which is a long time on radio, where we talked about faith. And there was a few details I could tell. Sam Newman was there and others. And I was doing some sexuality, relationships, education based on chastity at that time. And so that was mentioned. Oh, maybe Sam could get a bit of a lesson from you and stuff like that. And there was a bit of banter and stuff. But I was amazed by how many people in the months after that said to me they heard that interview and were somehow touched by something that happened, old grannies or young people or whoever. And the other lesson I really discovered from this was, I'd prayed for the opportunity to give witness, and then I'd been given it. And I realized, I don't pray enough for these moments to really, like in my work or when I'm going to meet somebody, give me the opportunity to do this or that. And of course, I tell this story a lot now in my speaking, when I'm speaking to teachers or when I'm speaking to other leaders or anybody, even young people, the opportunity to give witness, to evangelize, and to look for, obviously based on people's receptivity as well and being respectful of other people, but to share the importance, as St. Paul would say, pray for me that I will give the opportunity to give witness. And I think we too should do that because the Holy Spirit wants that we share the good news. And but it's not in our own strength. We can't do it if we're just trying our hardest. It's the Lord who opens the door. So that was that story with the footy in that 1995. Thank you for that, Mark.
I actually went in search for that 3AW recording, and believe it or not, it's quite sad. It's just excruciating. So that game, the 3AW commentary is online, but just sadly, right before you must have got online, it wasn't there.
Okay.
But nevertheless, if you're really interested, I'm sure you could actually call 3AW and their archives. Archives people
probably, if I heard the story, I'd find it's quite different in my memory than it is now. But
I was thinking I'm going to splice this into the interview when I get it. But alas, disappointing. But at least we've got you to tell.
Did it sound from the actual recording? Did it sound like I should have been best on ground, or was it one of those?
Oh, I didn't watch the whole game. I didn't watch the whole game, so I'm not sure. But if you want to kind of relive old times, it's right there for you. And Sam Newman's there, and everyone else. So
good answer. Sam was my ruck coach for a few years.
Oh, was he?
There was one occasion. There was one fun occasion. I love Sam. He's actually a good man, and he's got a lot of qualities actually as a person. One time he used to hold this huge bag, and we had ruck training on a Wednesday, and I'd have to run in and jump on the bag with my knee, and then tap it down to the rover or whatever when we did that. And on this particular occasion, I jumped right over the bag with my knee, hit him fair in the chin. He went flying, blood everywhere. He split his chin right open. He went flying. About 15 minutes later, he came out with a helmet on. We resumed the session. He was actually a good coach. I liked him.
I imagine the AFL must be a bit of a purgatory for him now, because he's so non-PC. And,
he is. And look, that's been part of his whole persona and what has made him so successful also in many ways on TV and on radio, and so appealing for many. But he's now being judged to be too off-putting for too many. I do think he says a lot of sound things. But yeah, he can lack sensitivity at times. There's no doubt.
Yeah. So heading back a couple of years, so after winning the 1991 Premiership, you were seriously considering a call to the priesthood, but you're in a relationship at the time. Can you tell us how your mind changed?
Yes. So, I mean, as a teen, I always imagined myself to be married, even though, I was given what had happened with my family, I was a bit afraid of being married. But I did feel that was my call. But when I was at the end of 1990 footy season, which was my first really serious playing every game in the seniors team, I went on a trip to Europe, actually to Rome and to France, and had a very powerful encounter with Jesus in a town called Paris-le-Monial, where in fact, we're actually in June now, aren't we? 350 years ago, Jesus appeared to St. Margaret Mary in this town, and I was there for the 300th anniversary of her death and had this powerful encounter with Jesus during that time. And it really did, even though I already had very strong faith, it really did open up a kind of new level of abandonment to God's will in my life. And so I began to ask the question, well, if you want me to be a priest, I'm open to that. I actually met a young bishop in Rome during that trip, George Pell, who was already a friend from that year, earlier in the year. And I asked his advice. And one of the things he said to me was, give yourself a year and to discern. So either, decide, put your hand to the plow and enter the seminary, or find a good girl and get married. I thought, that's very pragmatic advice. But it was actually quite good for me because I was a little bit overly spiritual at this time, not sort of very incarnated. And he was very sound in that sense. And I had a girlfriend during that trip, but I broke up after I came back from that girl, great girl, named Alison. And then started to discern the question of priesthood. This was the beginning of 1991, the season I had the Premiership, at the end of. But so for all of that year, I was thinking about priesthood. But 3 months after coming back from that trip, I met Annie, my now wife, and fell in love. And within a month, I realised, I've got this question of priesthood, but maybe God's giving me the gift of Annie. And so we started dating, and that very quickly became clear that we're very beautifully sort of matched and all that. But I did want to be faithful to the possibility that if God's calling me to something else, then I should do that. So I was quite open to Annie about that. So in all of that season, strangely, in all of 1991, which was my best season, I was player of the finals. I played state footy. I was best on ground at a state game against Victoria, but for Queensland, but beat Jimmy Steins, who won the Brownlow that year. I did really, really well. Played in the Premiership and was a pivotal player. I had in the back of my mind, should I be a priest? And actually, I played the grand final thinking this may be my last game. I really did. However, everything else was moving towards marriage, and there's a bit of a whole story here, but basically I did an Ignatian retreat in the December of that year, 1991, and it became very clear I had some attitudes that needed to be purified, and Holy Spirit kind of burnt away quite a lot of some of the pride that I had at that time. It's been a lot more journey for that, but there were other things. So it became clear at December of that year, no, I'm called to be married, not a priest. And then we got engaged, and the rest is history.
You've said how your parents' relationship had left you fearful of marriage, and I'm just wondering how you worked through that fear and what advice you'd give to those nowadays who have similar misgivings.
Yes, I was. I was terrified of marriage because of the example that I'd seen before my eyes for 5 or 6 very deeply wounding years, which led to my parents' separation at the end of my year 12 year. And for me, one of the things that I realized is that in those deeply wounding experiences of my teenage years, I was afraid of marriage, and one of the things when I think of the resurrection of Jesus, I see that Jesus showed his wounds. So to be resurrected didn't mean fixed up as if it didn't happen, as if the crucifixion hadn't happened, and that's true also of healing in our own lives, whatever form of healing it is. Being healed doesn't mean fixed up to a state of pre-wound,
Mm-hmm.
It means that the wound is kind of somehow glorified, So there is the process. And so for me, I underwent a long process, which continues in some ways, but which was sufficiently progressive and to allow me to be married and have the confidence of being married. So that included, obviously the love of Annie was a very healing source, because my mum was very aggressive really during those years, but Annie was very even and calm and peaceful, and that was very consoling to me. But it took me probably 5 years after we were married before I really felt like, well, she's not going to turn on me, So psychologically, I still had these reactions that I had to be aware of. This is my issue, not a objective reality. So knowing the difference between your subjective responses and the reality of things as they truly are is a beginning of the truth. But also other spiritual sources. So often, relying on the sacraments like Mass and confession, the prayers of people, like the support and prayers. So for example, one time I went to a kind of charismatic conference about forgiveness, and I was prayed over by a couple of women, and I didn't say anything, and they knew nothing of my history, but one of them had this kind of word of knowledge. She said, I feel like the Lord is saying to you to forgive your mum and to really not have any conditions on your mum. And I realized I was still very much expecting mum to convert to the faith, come back to the faith, to that I should love her only on the basis of what she should become, rather than actually just loving her for the sake of love, And it was a very pivotal moment. I was still in my 20s, and so I set out to continually, actively forgive my mum. And forgiveness is a very big source of healing. Obviously, if people are in situations where they are deep, they have to be protecting themselves from harm, that's not a healthy thing. They need to remove themselves from that sort of relationship. But oftentimes, a lot of things that can be restored. So anyway, for me, those were sources that helped me to trust that I could be married. The other thing was, if I could say, probably my faith helped me to realize that the sacrament of marriage requires much more than two human beings determined to make something happen. It was really that Jesus is really the center of marriage. So if you can put Jesus at the center and allow all of the sources of grace to become incarnated, that means listening to each other, spending time and all of that, then you can grow. And Annie and I have been called into working with married couples and engaged couples and young people dating and so on for many years now. And we've often given that advice that giving priority, your spouse is first, even above your children, and everything flows out of that. And so that confidence I got because of the sacrament of marriage and not the fact of relying on my own resources was probably a pivotal thing. And of course I was in love, and that helped too.
So out of this very healthy marriage have come 6 children. And one of your interests is helping strengthen bonds between fathers and sons. So I was wondering, what do you think is the most common cause of alienation between fathers and sons? And what are some things men can do to foster relationships with their boys?
Wow, that's about 5 questions.
Well, take your pick.
Okay. It's true. I mean, I have 3 sons and 3 daughters, and I recently wrote a book to my sons, which has been published, Tiny Book for Giant Men, and it's basically a very personal, intimate set of pieces of advice, very, very much from my own heart. And I also intend to write one which is percolating for my daughters, and I'm going to call that the Tiny Book for Beautiful Women. John Paul II said that every man needs to know that he has the capability to do it. You have what it takes, which I think deep down, men suffer from insecurity about that. And so it's a very deep, profound insight. And so I suppose that's one of the key to give reassurance. You do have what it takes. So the affirmation, "You are my son, my beloved son. You are good enough," it is at the very core of what a father or any man should offer to a younger man. So whether you're in leadership or a bishop or a priest or a father or a coach or a mentor or whatever, to actually give that confidence, even when it's not there in the person. And this is one of the things I learned from my dad, Father Landreth, this priest who my dad was an orphan. Basically, his own dad had left him and his stepfather was distant. And then he steps into the role of father. And my dad says he believed in him. Father Landreth believed in my dad, even when my dad didn't believe in himself. And I think this is at the heart of it, you matter. I affirm you count. You have what it takes. Trust me, it's all going to be fine. You're good enough, and that's what men need to know. Probably more than anything, I would say. And it's based on, I'm here for you. So the presence is a very. I wrote a chapter for a book that Rob Falzon wrote. Men Alive, Rob, and he wrote a first book called The Father Factor, which was more quantitative and looking at data and stuff. The second book was gathering 12 stories from different men. I wrote one of the chapters, and it was qualitative. And we were asked to sort of look at 3 men in our lives, and so one of them was my dad. And I talked about presence is a key factor. I also talked about Michael O'Brien, who's a Canadian author who you might know, who I have a correspondence relationship with for a number of years, and he's very close. As well as who was the other one? Cardinal Pell was meant to be one, but Rob, he was still in prison at that time, so I thought, that's maybe not a good. But I think that's an important quality for fathers and sons, is to, like, the Heavenly Father. The first thing we have in the gospel is basically him affirming his own son. "You are my son, I love you, the beloved." And I think that affirmation is the foundation of everything else. So if that's not there, the rest doesn't really. You got to build there. So to start with, so that'd be the first thing I'd say. I could go on for a lot of points here, but you get the. If you want to hear more, read the book.
Read the book. All right, I'll put a link in the description.
Okay, thank you.
So you did mention I suppose your initial acquaintance with Bishop George Pell back in the day, but you worked more closely with him over the years. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. I recently was asked by Tracy Rowland to contribute to a book that's being published by Ignatius Press. I think just been published. I think originally the title was The George Pell We Knew, but I think I've saw a title that's slightly different. But I had the great fortune of meeting him when I was 20. He was an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne, and my brothers and I had started a kind of parish ministry in our parish. And we went to a walk for Mary from the cathedral of the Catholic Cathedral to the Anglican Cathedral, and he celebrated the Mass at the Catholic Cathedral, and he walked with us, and we were really impressed of a bishop who loved Mary so openly, and so made contact, and he welcomed me and my brother Paul, and we went down and chatted with him and asked for his advice, and basically it was the beginning of a friendship. He ended up watching the grand final that I played in, sitting with Annie. So, we were friends. He came to dinner many times, but also he was a real mentor professionally. And so I worked in youth ministry for Melbourne Archdiocese for 5 years under his leadership. So I was in charge of the diocesan youth ministry, and then we went to live in Rome for 3 years, me and Annie, running a school of mission with the Emmanuel community, which I did. And then in that time, Cardinal Pell became Archbishop of Sydney, and he invited me to come and work at Sydney University in the chaplaincy, which I did for 3 years prior to the 3 years of the Sydney World Youth Day. So I I had 5 years under him as in youth ministry, 3 years under him in university chaplaincy, 3 years under him in World Youth Day, and working very closely with him, and then maintaining good relationships, all the way until the end. In fact, my two sons and I, we travelled together with him, not with him, but to Rome in November 2022, and had a long lunch with him for 4 hours prior to, just 2 months before he died. And so it was typically like very interesting, wide-ranging conversation, lots of fun. He's often cheeky, poking fun at you, and very interested in the boys and what they're doing, and with good advice, and fascinating company. And they said one of their highlights of the whole 3-week trip in Europe was lunch with Cardinal Pell.
Mm-hmm.
So he's had a huge influence in my life. He's I can't read the prison journal yet, because I visited him when he was in prison, but it's still raw, his death, because he was not just a figure who was so influential, but a real personal, one of my father figures. And my dad died 3 months ago, so I feel like my fathers are dying. I mean, they're in heaven, but so I think he was the best person I ever worked for, despite the popular reputation and the personal reality. It was worlds apart. Like, he was always fun. He gave me a lot of freedom. He was not at all a control freak in any way. He gave very clear parameters, broad parameters, clear goals, heaps of support, but then let you run. And I learnt a lot from that. I learnt a lot about leadership from him. So many things. And one of the things I said, I dedicated my book, my book, Tiny Book for Giant Men, to him. So the dedication was written for him. And one of the things I said in it, and it hasn't been said much about him that I've seen anyway, just how manly he was, and
stoic. I don't know anyone who could have put up with what he put up with in the media.
Like, his lack of rancor, like the fact that he was so lacking in bitterness, is a stunning testimony. Certainly, I would have absolutely no capacity to do that. Like, he was so poorly treated. I would say possibly, in terms of white martyrdom, which I think he certainly is a white martyr. In other words, he didn't get killed, as far as we know. Like, he wasn't, his blood wasn't shed, but like that whole public trial and his public reputation was smashed almost more than anybody I can imagine in the history of the world, because of the way the media runs. So, and he just seemed to be, like, when I visited him in prison, we had a fun time. Like, he was joking. I came out of that and I said to some priest friends of mine, I said, there's no way in the world this man is guilty. Like, I mean, I knew that. I actually knew that already, because there's no way
it was preposterous. The accusations, just any Catholic would know that couldn't have happened.
I mean, I guess that because because there were cases of people, you think, well, hold on, that ended up becoming true, and so people, but he was certainly someone whose whole personality was such an integrated personality, so balanced, and but his masculinity. Like, I remember one time, early in my 20s, when I was still playing footy for Hawthorn, I went down to Torquay, where he had a holiday house, or he stayed at a friend's holiday house, I think. But anyway, he was down there regularly at summers, and I think it might have been Chris Meaney. We're throwing a tennis ball in the beach at the Chris was at one. It might have been Chris. Was it Chris? Or, anyway, someone was throwing a ball, and Cardinal Pell and I were competing to catch it. And I was pretty fit and strong. He was still a big guy, and so I kept jumping ahead and whacking him, and he'd start punching. It was such fun. And after a while, he was getting frustrated. He'd clonk me on the back of the head. But always in good. He knew, like, my daughters, my wife, they love him. Like, he had relationships with some of my kids which went beyond our relationship to him. Like, he would see them, and especially during Sydney times when they were living in Sydney and studying up Campy or somewhere. But like Phoebe, or Jerome, or Ambrose, or Hannah, or Georgie, it was after whom she was named after him, and Dom. he just loved people, and he was interested, and he would spend time. He was never someone like, right, that's half an hour, your time's up. He would really invest in people, and he seemed to have a heck of a lot of, like so many people all around the world seem to have such relationships with him. So many people I encounter who over many decades have sort of he's cultivated relationships with all around the world. You think, how did he get time? Like he just seemed to, like, I know for me, I feel very privileged because I had so much time with him and, over many years. But there seems to be lots of people who did. And I think that is an enormous gift. And he taught me a lot about investing in people and really spending, not being on the clock. Obviously, you have to be efficient. And, he was also a very good organizer and brilliant organizer. Rare qualities combined in one person. We won't see many people like him.
Yeah.
And I really do think history will look very, very kindly on him. As yet, it hasn't happened, but
he's already had his first miracle, so that can be the path of beatification.
Has it been verified though?
I'm not sure if it's that far along, but it's.
No, I agree. Look, I agree. And look, by their fruits you'll know them. Just look at the fruits of his ministry in Sydney and Melbourne, and internationally, and it's enormous already. So, but you're right. I think we will see. I think we'll see more and more of that happen over time.
Just thinking back to when you were talking about on the beach catching the ball, he was potentially a ruckman for Richmond at some point, wasn't he?
He was.
Yeah,
he
had been two AFL types.
Yeah, and he did love footy. He loved it. I think it was one of the biggest sufferings for him to move to Sydney. He didn't say that much because he couldn't in Sydney, but those of us from Melbourne knew that he suffered. He suffered about that. But it's funny because I didn't mind occasionally reminding him. I said, people say, and it's a big thing in the media, the footballing Cardinal and all that. I said, but you actually never went to Richmond, did you? You went into the seminary. You didn't really prove yourself yet. So you're a could-have-been champion.
That's right.
So he did, and he'd look at me with that glint in his eye, and he'd have a cheeky smile, and he said, "Yeah, you got me on that one."
So, moving from one archbishop to the other, to another, you've Julian Porteous down in Tassie. I believe you've been doing some work down there. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Archbishop Julian and I are very close friends, also because of our work together. I met him for the first time in the late 80s in Hawthorn. After footy training one day, I went to the house of Mary Galbraith, and I was there, and Archbishop Julian, who was Father Julian at the time and part of Disciples of Jesus community, but who'd also been very connected to the Emmanuel community, which I've helped to become part of its foundations 3 decades ago. And he and I had a close contact also when he was the rector of the seminary in Sydney. We lived, after coming from Rome, we lived in the seminary, our family. So we had 6 kids living in one of the houses at the back of the seminary. Some of my kids sometimes said at the time, we live in a cemetery. And, he had a pool. So here's his house, Bishop Julian's house, as rector, was kind of connected to the seminary, but it was sort of next door. And we had a fence that we could go through that went to the pool and the tennis court, which was the seminary's, but it was strictly speaking in the property that was Bishop Julian's house. And our kids some of our kids did homeschool for a little bit, and they'd often be swimming in the pool. And there was one time, Jerome, who's now 21, he's the president of the students at Campion. Bishop Julian came out in his bathers, his togs, or what do you call them, swimmers in Sydney, Jerome said, "Oh, Bishop Julian, come and have a swim in our pool," So he and he didn't say anything; he just smiled. But look, professionally, he's been a beautiful bishop for Australia. He still is, but obviously he's put his resignation in last June to the Pope because he had to legally, according to canon law. He's still Archbishop of Hobart. I've been working there through my business for the last 7 or 8 years, initially giving some advice about youth ministry for the diocese when they were kind of considering. So I do a fair bit of consultation on things like that, but also doing a lot of work in Catholic education in Tasmania, working with religious education coordinators, providing formation for them on a quarterly basis. I work closely with a guy called Martin Tobin, who's a fantastic operator, who's the director of evangelization and Catholic education. This is working under Jared Gaskin, who's the boss there. He's a brilliant man and does a great job. So I've been doing kind of a whole lot of other projects in Tasmania, coaching and speaking and doing work with early career teachers, really on the question of integrating faith into teaching, integrating faith into education, equipping them in their professional capabilities, but also personal, and connecting them so that they're integrated, so they're more effective as evangelizers in education. So it's been a lot of my work there, but I've also done some other things, helping with their, the formation for their leaders to go to World Youth Days or to go to Australian Catholic Youth Festival. I ran a priest retreat. I do more and more work now with priests in their coaching. I have a few priests who I coach or provide supervision to. But Archbishop Julian asked me to give a 4-day retreat for priests, which was a bit daunting, to be honest, because as a layman. But I mean, obviously, I do a lot of work with faith leaders, and there are certain questions that are more difficult for me to sort of address them too. But in fact, in the end, we're all called to the same vocation, to keep our eyes on Jesus and to keep renewing that first love. And so there's some of the areas. I probably have other ones, but I had a meeting yesterday. I'm working with helping to write a curriculum for Year 12 that they're doing in the diocese there for studies of religion. So there's some of the things that I do. I work a lot in Tasmania, but also in other dioceses, WA and New South Wales and Queensland and so forth. So I've been to Adelaide, spoke to the whole of the South Australian Catholic education was in the middle of COVID or just before, and I think it sort of didn't go anywhere after that because everything stopped. But I'd love to keep working in South Australia or beyond.
Yeah,
I do love one-to-one work, and also working with whole groups like staff spirituality days. I do in many schools, whole day kind of retreat type thing. And it's interesting with them because you have a cross section of, you got people who are not even Catholics or whose worldview is not religious at all, and sometimes maybe even hostile. Sometimes, right to those who are deeply Catholic, and to try and present a day that's both attractive, but also and helps them to recognise the gift that they give, whether even if they're not believers in the church, but if they bring truth, beauty, or goodness to their work as a teacher or as a working in the grounds or in the front office or wherever, then they're bringing God into the place. So I help them, I affirm that and help them understand that through a workshop, but at the same time invite them into a very personal encounter with Christ, and into the sacraments and to the teaching and the mind of the church, and to help them understand there's a supernatural vision that we have to inculcate into Catholic education and parenting or ministry. Because I also do something, I think, working strategic planning for ministry. So I have a number of who aren't working in diocese, but maybe, for example, Real Talk or, Culture Project, or some of those groups who operate as kind of independent operations, helping with them with their strategic planning and some of the coaching, supporting their leaders. So that's a bit of an idea of what I do. But Tasmania, coming back to your question, has been the place where I've done probably most of my work. That's been my biggest of all the different places
area of activity.
I've done more in Tassie than probably anywhere else. And I love going to Tassie. Beautiful place.
And you also love going on pilgrimages, it seems. You're organising one shortly. Can you tell us what the itinerary is?
Sure. So I do love pilgrimages, as you heard from my story. Since I was 20, I've been on many, many pilgrimages. I've led 7 World Youth Day pilgrimages, including hosting the Sydney World Youth Day as a director of evangelisation for that. Other pilgrimages with other groups during youth ministry or university chaplaincy, or this one's with the Emmanuel community. So I'm the leader of the Emmanuel community with my wife Annie in Melbourne, and I'm leading this particular pilgrimage for national with a group from Sydney and other parts of Australia, Wagga and others. There's 103 in total of us. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And in 2 weeks, we're going to Rome for a week. I won't give you all the details, but you can imagine that major basilicas and so forth. Plus a week in Paray-le-Monial, where I talked about before, the city of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which is the spiritual home of the Emmanuel community, and in this year of Jubilee. So we've got a week in Rome and a week in France. And then I'll be spending a week with Annie and a few of my kids who are coming with us to Belgium, where one of my other daughters has just recently had a baby. So we'll be going to the baptism and having a week of holiday at the end of the pilgrimage. So, yeah, this is huge. I'm looking forward to having it, but I'm also looking forward to having it finished. And I think there'll be many graces during this pilgrimage, very, very many graces that I'm looking forward to receiving. And it's kind of sort of at the point now where most of the work's been done. It's just a matter of now receiving and going on the pilgrimage. So exciting, right. But and we will have an Angelus with the Pope. I'm looking forward to I'm loving Pope Leo, everything I'm seeing. It's given me a great deal of consolation and confidence. Yeah. The Lord has really said in front of the whole world, you are Peter on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. And no matter what sometimes seems to be going on, generation after generation, the church continues. And it's a real sign. The whole world was looking. The world, despite every evidence at times to the contrary, the world is looking to the church for hope, for purpose, for happiness.
There was a real sense of it this time around. You did feel like all eyes were on it, and everyone's going on about the black smoke and the white smoke. Everyone was fascinated. So
it's actually a big grace for us to be aware of as committed Catholics or Christians, that especially Catholics, that people are interested. There's something. There is a mystery. I was talking yesterday to Martin Tobin, my contact in Tassie, and he was telling me about 2 schools in the very remote parts of Western Tasmania, where there's one, like where we were visiting last year, but there's one teacher was talking about 5 students who are being baptized, and another one 8 students who are being baptized. Like these are there's things happening that are just.
I'm hearing the same thing. I'm hearing of a parish up in Childers, regional Queensland, that all these kids from the school are asking to be baptized. So something's moving,
And that means those of us who are have the faith, and we need to be ready and to receive these people and really give them, because it could keep growing, and we need to kind of be willing to throw ourselves in and support them. So it's surprising, to be honest. It's been a difficult time, but praise God.
One last thing, Steve. If you could just tell us a little bit about what the Emmanuel community is. So if those who are kind of curious about it might learn more, and also just a final plug for Altum Leadership Group as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll start with Emmanuel. So Emmanuel Community is a new community in the church. It's basically a place where mostly lay people. It's made up of people of all states of life. So you got lay people, married people, single people, but also men and women who are consecrated in celibacy. They're not religious, strictly speaking. They're lay consecrated. It's a new form in the church. We have, I think, 200 sisters and about, I'm not sure how many brothers, less. And there's a few hundred priests. There are also priests who are diocesan priests, but also they are members of the Emmanuel community. So there's, I could go into detail, but so there's all states of life and living together, common call to holiness in the world. So Emmanuel means God is with us. So the call is very much to be in the world, not of the world, but in the world. So many of us live in our normal lives. And so we come together, on a weekly basis and a monthly basis to share the word of God and to pray. And it's a grace of the charismatic renewal. At the same time, very deeply planted deeply in the sacraments and the contemplative life of the church, and a love for the magisterium and for the saints. And the main charisms we say are adoration. So it's based on Eucharistic adoration and the love for the Eucharist and the heart of Jesus. The spirituality of the Paray-le-Monial I mentioned is the place where we meet. Really, the core, the heart of Jesus is in the Eucharist. And it's time with Jesus in the Eucharist and long time of personal prayer and the Word of God that transforms us and helps us to love people and the world with his love. So that's where compassion, which is the second grace, second major grace of the community. So adoration and then compassion and then evangelization. So we meet the material and practical human needs through compassion, through presence, and also spiritual needs, the ultimate needs for God himself. And so evangelization in all sorts of forms. We do street missions, we do married couple retreats, we do working with young people, many things different like that. So basically, it started in 1972, so it's a new community. It's in about 50 or so countries. There are maybe 12,000 members. It's not very big in that sense. In Australia, it's been going for just over 30 years. My wife Annie and I were part of its beginnings 30 odd years ago. And it's in different places. Mostly Sydney and Melbourne are the two main sort of foundations, but in fact there's a growing smattering of people in between and in like Brisbane and places in New South Wales, and there's a few little sort of new beginnings. So we have a national leadership now. We had these kind of individual local sectors, but now we have a national leadership. Paul and Swazik Morrissey, I don't know if you know Paul Morrissey, president
I
of
do, yeah.
Campion.
Yep.
Paul
I was at Campion when he came on as president. So
Paul and Swazik are the national leaders since January, and this is a very big sort of grace for us because some of these new beginnings, which are in the middle of what we call Middle Earth between Sydney and Melbourne, are starting in Albury and Wagga and Dubbo and, places like that. So that's roughly the Emmanuel community. I could sort of wax lyrical a lot, but it's a very big grace and a great joy to be part of it. It's a big commitment. It's like there is a cost of discipleship, and so there does require you making decisions for this and not for that. But I love being a member of the Emmanuel community, and it's been my call, and that call I discovered originally in France and have lived it in Australia. And so the School of Mission in Rome that I helped to run was part of that. Yeah. So that's basically Emmanuel community. The church has approved its statutes from John Paul II all the way through, and there's gradual amendments as we go along. And we're really very much committed to being one with the church, and locally and also universally under the Pope and the bishops, and submit to the magisterial teaching of the church, which we love, not at all a difficult submission. Called to hopefully sanctify the world in our daily life, in our work, and in our families, and so on. So that's basically the Emmanuel community. For my work, Altum Leadership Group, which I started 8 years ago, I'm actually I feel like I'm in a time of grace of a new phase of that, which over the next 12 months will grow. But it's working with leaders one-to-one in mentoring and coaching and supervision is an area where I'm gifted in and I love to do, and I think there's a lot of fruit that comes out of that. It's confidential, of course. So also speaking, I love to do speaking and giving testimony and providing formation in faith and in leadership, particularly faith leadership, but also looking at character and evangelization and special projects. I'm part of my difficulty of my personality is I'm not that structured, but the upside of that is that I'm quite intuitive, and so am able to adapt and look at very specific situations and help with people who have to deal with particular challenges about how to bring the gospel in a fruitful way in this context, and to see where the graces are and to cooperate with them rather than just have a preconceived notion this is how it's got to work. So I love to think, for example, of someone like Barnabas and Paul, Barnabas in particular, whose feast was last week. When he went to Antioch, he saw that grace had been given. And then, and I think the identification of where the grace is a very big challenge for faith leaders. And that's something that I love to help with that. And that's been something that I hope to do more and more of. How's that sound?
Very good. Thank you, Steve. The link will be in the description with some others. If you've enjoyed our interview, please like, share, and subscribe to the Thomas More Centre. We have a weekly newsletter that comes out mostly Wednesdays. So if you want to get some nice edifying reading, please do sign up. Steve Lawrence joining us from Melbourne. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mark. Been great.